No. Hello everybody, it's George from Ireland here. So I'm doing another live video. There's a shout going out to all my loyal listeners across the globe. Now this is a very timely video. It's topical because this is the thing in the news. The United Kingdom is supposedly leaving the European Union in 61 days, if my computation serves me correctly. So Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, he advised the Queen to prorogue Parliament just a few days ago. So Parliament's going to come back in early September, sit for just a few days, and then it'll be on recess. They'll have a holiday. They would have had a holiday anyway in late September because that's party conference season, but he's making it slightly longer. And some people are up in arms about that. They're protests in the centre of London. They briefly blocked Westminster Bridge, right beside Parliament, composed upon Westminster Bridge. You William Wordsworth fans. And Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of Her Majesty's most loyal opposition, has called for protests to paralyse the United Kingdom, but it's not happening. Now, there are some ultra Remainers who are protesting, but it hasn't caught the imagination as much as some protested earlier this year. This is a coup. Stop the coup, they're chanting. And there's all this preposterous hyperbole saying it's a dictatorship. If you really think it's a dictatorship, get on the next plane, Corbyn. Flee to Cuba, seek refugee status. And Nicola Sturgeon has said the same ludicrous thing. It's dangerous. It's utterly dishonest. It's irresponsible. It's childish. It's moronic to cry wolf like that. Because if a totalitarian threat really does come along, people wouldn't give you any credit. Because these opposition politicians are not being locked up. This very protest proves it's not remotely dictatorial. So Parliament will just sit for 4 days fewer than it otherwise would have done. And obviously there's a court case to try to prevent the Parliament session being foreshortened. Gina Miller, that veteran Remain campaigner, has been joined by Sir John Major, the erstwhile Conservative Prime Minister. He was Prime Minister from 1990 to 1997. He's the oldest living former Prime Minister. So there's a very inconvenient fact that Major's overlooking. When he was Prime Minister, he prorogued Parliament in March 1997. Why? Because there was an acutely embarrassing investigation coming up of what his government had been up to. So he'd really rather not have that, and he prorogued it. But somehow the United Kingdom did not turn into a dictatorship. It is the height of hypocrisy, and it's just imbecilic for him to join this. Really, I'm glad that he has, because it's undermined the credibility of those who are unhappy about it. Now, you could think it was a bad thing, but you should not go around saying that the United Kingdom is suddenly on the verge of turning into dictatorship. Even Sir John Bercow has weighed in on this. So Sir John, he is the Speaker of the House of Commons. It's a bit like being a referee in a sport or an umpire. So he's a neutral figure and says, it's your turn to speak. Thank you, sit down. It's your turn to speak. Yes. No, you can't say that. You must withdraw that remark. Unparliamentary language, and so forth. There's a list of things they can't say. They can't swear at each other. They're not allowed to accuse each other of being in a crapulous state, and so forth. So what else? So the Speaker, he's elected. He's elected for constituency. It's Buckingham in his case. He's a former Conservative MP. And there was a gentleman's agreement throughout the 20th century that it would alternate between the two major parties, Labour and Conservative. But this broke down in the 90s when one Labour speaker followed another, as in Sir Michael Martin came in, but he disgraced himself by speaking out on a contentious matter, and now Sir John has done likewise. Now, you could fully concur with Bercow, but still think he was wrong to vocalise his opinion on it. Okay, he's a highly political chap, he's very well informed, he's bristling with opinions. I've met him once, but he still shouldn't express them, because that undermines a sense of impartiality. But I fear I'm repeating what I said yesterday night on this same head. So back to parliamentary sovereignty. Well, what is it? That is that Parliament really governs things. Often they say the crown in Parliament. The sovereign is the monarch. So they say, well, the legislature is made up of the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and indeed the monarch. Although she, in this case, she simply signs up on absolutely everything that's presented to her. Fascinatingly, in Belgium, who was it, the previous king, Albert, he refused to, back in the 80s, an abortion bill. He abdicated, blah, 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 which meant the head of state was not his younger brother, oddly. It was a Belgian cabinet who, within 24 hours, ceded their powers back to him. But back to parliamentary sovereignty, so that Parliament reigns, sovereignty is rightful power, to put it in plain language. And so Parliament controls things. Now, the United Kingdom is part of the European Union, but the theory is that's because Parliament has chosen to pool its sovereignty with other member states. People say that cede them or surrender them, but no, Europhiles say pool, share it. You can have some of our sovereignty, we'll have some of yours, because they will all cooperate. All right, it's a reasonable theory. I'm not a Europhile myself. I don't think the European Union is downright evil. It's not damnable. There are a few good things about it. So there's the theory. Now, Walter Bagehot, he is one of the foremost constitutionalists, theorists of British politics, 19th century banker, but he's best known for publishing the English Constitution. Perhaps ought to have been called the British Constitution. But in those days, people often said English when they ought to have said British. It was a well-known synecdoche. So, and his book, we often just call it Bagehot rather than the English Constitution. But his name is spelled Bagehot. And he said Parliament is supreme in all things except the power to destroy its omnipotence. So it can do anything. It could outlaw wearing blue. It could make it mandatory to eat raisins on Tuesday afternoon, or whatever. That's the idea. But it cannot give away this power. It cannot prevent future parliaments from having any power. So obviously the EU membership is compatible with this if you argue, well, the United Kingdom is only sharing its power, not giving it away, and could take it back at some point. The other one is no parliament could bind its successors. Supposing the United Kingdom were to pass an act saying that Lancashire is renamed Wibbleland this year, there's a general election next year, and Parliament is elected, and next year they decide to repeal that legislation, and Wibbleland becomes Lancashire again. That would be an example. Now, because Parliament obviously means the people who meet the elected politicians of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, well, Lords not elected, but it also means the length of time for which it sits, all right? So people were elected in 2017, that 2017 Parliament went on into 2018, went on to 2019, may have election this winter, or might be next year or after. But it's the 2017 Parliament if you follow. Now, the thing is that we have another election. Most of those who are MPs at the moment would be re-elected. A few would lose their seats. Some would choose to retire. A couple will have died. So you might say, but that's mostly the same individuals. It is mostly the same individuals, but we mean it's another parliament as it's another parliamentary session. So parliamentary term is up to 5 years. Obviously, there'll be several recesses each year. But touches on prorogation, because there are at least 2 prorogations each year anyway. Bojo is just bringing in a third one, and there are several precedents for that. The John Major one I cited under Charles I. Do you agree that being in the EU is accepting all the freedoms of the EU in exchange for tariff-free single market, and access is leaving is the opposite? Well, obviously, the European Union has said that you must accept the 4 freedoms, as in the free movement of people, capital, goods and services. So yes, that's what the EU amounts to, and they don't have tariffs on each other's goods. Now, this thing about free movements of goods and services, there are some exceptions to that. There's certain constraints on this if you think it's immoral according to your country's philosophy. For example, some inflatable love dolls from Denmark weren't allowed here in the 80s and things like that. Or you consider that a certain item is dangerous, like some speedboats or type of motorcycle, you are allowed to ban things. So this freedom of movement of goods and services is not absolute, and no tariffs. And I can't quite remember the end of the question, but so if the United Kingdom were to leave the European Union, as it's supposed to do, by the end of October, then the UK would no longer be bound by all this, or you might say benefit from all this, depending on your view. So the United Kingdom and the EU might agree to maintain some of it, the free movement of goods, but perhaps not of services, or of goods and services, but not of people, or goods and services and people, but not of capital, or something like that. So there's going to be some limitation. I don't think there's much doubt about that. There is, of course, the European Free Trade Area. Switzerland, Norway, and several other countries are part of that, but not part of the European Union. However, they're required to accept quite a lot of the regulation. So if they're wanting to sell their goods and services into the European Union, their goods must meet the safety standards prescribed by the European Union. Their services, well, their workers must have certain rights partly because if you made people work longer hours, you might get a competitive advantage for your company, and that wouldn't be fair on the other EU member states. The trouble is, this is only good as your enforcement. And I know in Romania, spent a couple of years there, these things are very laxly enforced. People selling food beside the road with no license and just getting away with it doesn't bother me. But people say, well, we can't be in the Norway situation. We'd accept all the regulation without having a say in it. Obviously, the UK has got a rather limited say in it anyway, having, I think it's 12% of the EU population rather than less of the EU's representation, because the largest states are discriminated against in terms of representation in the European Parliament, which alternates between Brussels and Strasbourg, which again is an example of how the EU is so profligate, moving back and forth every couple of months between the two, and also is very bad for the environment. And the EU is all supposed to be all about safeguarding the environment. Choose a capital and stick to it. I don't really mind which one, partly because it was in Brussels, because nobody thought that Belgium was going to dominate them. In Strasbourg, people could say, oh, well, that shows French mastery. And but the French wanted it in Strasbourg. So where were we? So the thing is, the EU legislation applies to behind borders traders, cross borders trades. What the UK would do internally, it would also be governed by that if you'd have a Norway situation. Norway, Switzerland, Turkey, they all have some sort of deal. It was all different with each one of them with the EU. I only ask, as I understood, you can't have your cake and eat it, as you can't pick and choose which of the 4 freedoms you still want, and the following is disappeared. Well, that's what the EU said. They might be willing to change. Obviously, the UK wouldn't be part of the European Union, and some people have said that. So there's some trade advantages to being in it. There's some trade disadvantages to being in it. But I agree, you probably can't have the benefits of being the EU without accepting some of the obligations. But there are some trade benefits to leaving the EU. So the European Union negotiates as a trade bloc with another country, for instance, Canada. But let's say Canadian products, supposing maple syrup, for example, what are the rules about that? The safety standards and the tariffs, are there going to be none? And there might be an EU country which produces its own maple syrup and doesn't want too much Canadian maple syrup in because that will compete too effectively. Whereas the UK might say, we don't produce any maple syrup, so we don't care. We'll give the Canadians a good deal on this one. But on the other hand, there's another Canadian product we don't want in here too much, Canada Goose jackets, because that will take away from our company, which produces whatever similar jackets. So because they're 28 member states, what is advantageous to one might be disadvantageous to another, and so on. So there are some trade advantages to being out of that as well. Obviously, the UK is paying in more money, but we're getting a little bit distracted. We're getting mired in the merits and the demerits of Brexit, and I don't wish to be bogged in that. I'm actually bored rigid of it because we've been talking about it for several years. So back to Parliament not being able to bind its successors. Take back control was one of the most effectual and most remembered slogans of the Brexit campaign for that referendum in June 2016. Because obviously so much power had been ceded to Brussels and Strasbourg, and the European Union, obviously it rules its member states through regulations, through directives, through decisions. So regulations apply to everyone in the EU immediately, that's it. So obviously they do bind the UK and Parliament doesn't have any say in it. Now you may say that's only because Parliament has agreed to cede its powers to the European Union. Directives, so the EU would say you must achieve whatever standard by a certain deadline. You can go beyond that standard, but you can't go less than that standard, or there'll be a fine if you don't. Good evening from home, countries dedicated as anti-Brexit subscriber. Okay, well, I welcome anti-Brexiteers. I'm willing to listen to what you have to say. I have reservations about my position. Could be that I'm mistaken. Now, I really want Brexit to happen for a multitude of reasons. But if it doesn't happen, there's a silver lining through the dark cloud shining. The pound will go up and that'll be good for me. So worse things could happen than staying in. I didn't believe we were going to win in 2016. Things this good just don't happen. And I thought, well, what will I do when we lose? Well, I'll shrug my shoulders and have to accept it. Likewise, the Republic of Ireland, I wanted us to vote no to Maastricht way back in the 1992 referendum. But I said, okay, well, it's been voted for, just have to accept it and make the best of it. That's it. It's not going to be reversed. And many people took that view in the United Kingdom with regard to the European Economic Community in the 1975 referendum. Go back to 75. 6 months before that referendum, it showed that 2/3 of people were going to vote to leave the EEC. In fact, 2/3 voted to stay in. So actually 1/3 of the population changed their opinion. It was a huge shift in quite a short space of time. But almost every MP was on that side, and newspapers. Anyway, I digress once more. I'm an American, and at the very least, it's a good show watching from here. Well, Zachary Hebert, sorry, I hope you don't mind me saying your name. I very much appreciate you tuning in. So, democracy is majority vote rule. Tom Hulme. Yeah, well, people often say that, and to some extent it is. That's an important part of it, and that's a mantra that Brexiteers can come back to. And we say, well, there have to be safeguards for minorities. That's true. And then independence of the judiciary, and what is just and what is legal is not always popular. And so I think it's right that judges be insulated from that, from elections, and they do the right thing, popular or unpopular. You do the right thing. Don't care about that. Fiat justitia, ruat caelum. Okay, that's the old Latin tag, let justice be done, though the sky should fall. Okay, so take back control. Now, it's true that the UK was represented in Strasbourg and the Council of Ministers, Parliament, which is often Strasbourg, the Council of Ministers and so on, and the EU's cabinet, effectively. The commissioners, there, oh my God, 20-something commissioners. There was one for almost every member state with a different area of responsibility, external relations, as in foreign affairs, security, health, education, blah, blah, blah. But a lot of these things were actually beyond the remit of the EU. It was slightly coming in. Loads of domestic legislation in the United Kingdom was simply transposing EU directives into domestic law. Now, EU legislation isn't bad per se. It could be wonderful, it could be bad, it could be neutral. Supposing the United Kingdom wasn't in the EU, it might pass some of this legislation for itself anyway, choose to implement similar health and safety standards. And the world, the whole world has moved forward in terms of raising standards of health and safety. I think sometimes you can go too far and be too much of a nanny state thing, but this is a whole libertarian, authoritarian argument. You might say that EU doesn't go far enough. So the 1975 referendum, which I mentioned earlier, was a post factum one. The United Kingdom had already joined the European Economic Community as it then was. So the 9 member states became 12 because the Republic of Ireland, UK and Denmark all joined on the first day, the 1st of January 1973. So the EU likes to do things on New Year's Day, keeps it simple, hey? And that was Edward Heath, the Conservative government, led the UK in. And there'd been the European Communities Bill, which passed. The bill became an act once it was passed. Heath was an ardent Europhile. He agreed with Harold Wilson, leader of the opposition, who was a Labour guy. But the trouble is, Wilson didn't like the actual terms of coming in. He agreed with the principle. Wilson tried to get the UK in, he said he tried to get the UK in several years earlier. But in the early 70s, Labour whipped people to vote against it. A large number of Labour rebels defied the whip and voted for the European Communities Act anyway, hence it was passed. The Liberal leader, Jeremy Thorpe, he'd been a passionate Europhile right from the get-go. So Liberals like to say they weren't left or right, they didn't believe in a left-right axis, they were ahead of the other parties. They're very modern and go ahead. As Thorpe Riley said, Conservatives are in favour of every reform except the next one. They're always a bit behind, but once the reforms are there, they simply grumble and accept them. So, anyway, Harold Wilson, he sent out a mail shot to the whole UK, obviously misused taxpayers' money to fund EEC propaganda. If I'd been alive in 1975, I would have voted for the UK to stay in the EEC. Being in the Republic of Ireland in 1972, I would have voted for us to join the EEC. The EEC is not the EU. It's expanded in terms of member states. It's changed its name for a good reason, because its nature has changed very considerably. And there have been so many more treaties, it's much more integrated. When it really was a common market, the EEC was often called the common market, that was different. The political dimension of it was much less developed. Now, can you separate economics and politics? Not really, they're enmeshed. But anyway, Harold Wilson's mail shot to everyone in 1975, in the run-up to the referendum, said that membership will depend on the continuing assent to Parliament. Now, these were golden words to J. Enoch Poll. Enoch Poll, former Conservative MP, later also Unionist MP, an arch Eurosceptic. He was an indefatigable campaigner for British independence, even in the mid-80s when that was deeply unpopular, when he was almost the only MP who wanted that. So there was a fascinating case called Factor Tame in the mid-80s. Parliament passed the the Merchant Shipping Act, And this clashed with some EEC legislation. Remember, it was the European Economic Community back then, not the European Union. That didn't kick in until 1993. And there was a Spanish ship called Factor Tame, and there were some restrictions on ships, foreign ships, fishing in British waters, several court cases. The long and the short of it is that the British Act of Parliament was illegal, and it made it crystal clear that EU law took precedence over British law. So if you're a Europhile, you might think that's fine. And Edward Heath had obviously pulled the wool over people's eyes, saying that joining the EEC involves no essential loss of national sovereignty. What's essential? That's the operative word. How much is essential? It's imponderable. And his civil servants had briefed him the exact opposite, that it would. And I can't remember which judge it was. Lord Denning said it will be like an incoming tide, the law. How many years will it take for the UK to become a WTO member again? Good question. A World Trade Organization member again? I'm not sure. Now, the Honourable Jacob Rees-Mogg might assure us blithely immediately, because obviously the UK has been doing everything via the European Union. And one of the Europhile arguments is the United Kingdom is part of a much bigger bloc. Instead of being up to 70 million people, is over 500 million people, and therefore has more clout. That's true, but there are drawbacks, as I pointed out. But is money everything? Okay, so some people might say, even if it diminishes the United Kingdom economically, it's worth it for other reasons, because there can be controlled immigration. Well, the UK won't be paying so much into other member states and can pass its own laws, and that's got to be worth something. And the EU could be good for some segments of society, but not others. There's a reason why London's so in favour of it, because, well, a lot of London businesses rely on people who've moved from other EU member states. But there are these left-behind constituencies, particularly in northern England, along the east coast, where they haven't seen the benefit of it. And people often point out, the more educated you are, the more likely you are to be a Europhile. Okay, now that's partly something to do with economic self-interest. Of course, most people are guided by self-interest to at least some extent. And so for let's say, academics who get loads of EU grants, they love it. The Erasmus programme, for people in the professional classes, for those who don't even have any GCSEs, for blue-collar workers, well, they just experience wage compression. Not that immigrants are bad, and they've come from EU countries, absolutely legally entitled to be here. They're not wicked, don't resent them, but they have driven down wages. I don't hold it against them. If I were them, I'd probably come here too. Fine. But just stating it without being judgmental or condemning anyone. Being an immigrant is an entirely honourable thing to be. And immigrants can be splendid in many ways. So, okay, what else? So that was arguably, the Factor Tame case, an example where parliamentary sovereignty had been eroded. I know Europhiles say, well, that's only because the Parliament had agreed to this, because it agreed to join the EEC knowing this was the case. But obviously the EU evolved, the EEC evolved, I should say, turned into the EU eventually, that metamorphosis, but there were several staging posts like the Single European Act, signed by Margaret Thatcher in 1985. She later became increasingly Eurosceptic. Okay, parliamentary sovereignty. Well, Parliament voted to have that referendum act. Nick Clegg, when he was leader of the Liberal Democrats about 10 years ago, he said there ought to be a referendum on the United Kingdom's membership of the EU. And of course, he was fairly sure that his side would win. He's the Eurocrat's Eurocrat. He'd been at the College of Europe. He'd briefly worked as a journalist. He'd worked for a British European Commissioner, Leon Britton, who was a former Conservative politician, and all the rest of it. So he'd worked outside politics for 1 year in his life. But he got hoisted on his own petard. Be careful what you may wish for, you may get it. And he's been knighted. And I think he truly deserves that gong, because Clegg's incompetent and clunky leadership helped to ensure that Brexit came about. And he famously debated Nigel Farage several years ago, and he kept false accusing Farage of lying. He was using these sort of all these ad hominem arguments, this appeal to ridicule, saying, "Oh, you're like these people who say Elvis is still alive," and was himself bereft of rational arguments. And of course, Farage bested him. Farage, who has no experience of tertiary education, Clegg, who went to Robinson College, Cambridge, and Clegg still lost. So not terribly articulate, are you? So Parliament voted for the Referendum Act. Referendum. Let's go doing some Latin. Refer eundem. Ask them. That's what it literally means. So they were asked. Now, it's true that Parliament is not legally obliged to give effect to what the people want, but nobody beforehand said that they wouldn't. the United Kingdom has held, well, only a few referenda for the whole of the UK. It's held lots for parts of the UK, only for Northern Ireland, only for Scotland, only for Wales, only for London, only for like Birmingham, shall we have a directly elected mayor, and various other cities and regions. But in every single case, what people have decided in the referendum is what has been done. But anyway, this is the first time when lots of people said, oh, well, we should just disregard it. David Lammy was one of those. Got to hand it to him. He said it right from the get-go. But supposing the result had gone the other way, supposing the Remainers had won by a narrow margin, would it have been acceptable for Parliament to say, well, we're leaving anyway? I don't think so. I think there would have been shrieks of fury and outrage from Remainers had that transpired. So the only reason was to find out what the people want and do what they want, and Cameron and so many other politicians pledged that they would implement the popular will. MPs voted to give the referendum. Tom Hulme, you are on the money, absolutely right. So therefore they should implement it. And I remember at the referendum in Wales in '97, only 50% turnout, only just over 50% voted to have a Welsh Assembly, yet still it was done. And there are more examples of that. Okay, so then there was the EU Notice of Withdrawal Act. Parliament voted to do that, to tell the EU in March 2017, we're leaving in 2 years. The clock started ticking. So that was that. Passed overwhelmingly. That 2017 election, the Conservatives promised to deliver Brexit. Labour promised to deliver Brexit. The Liberal Democrats promised to deliver Brexit, but they said they'd have a referendum on the final deal. I don't think anyone opposed it in principle. Scotland, so the SNP opposed it for Scotland because in Caledonia, most people have voted against. Sinn Féin are against it because, of course, in Northern Ireland, most people voted against. But Sinn Féin want to do everything to be bloody-minded and everything to be different from England. Obviously, their whole raison d'etre is to take Northern Ireland out of the UK and into the Republic of Ireland. Though, of course, Sinn Féin is totally anti-independence because they want to be in the European Union. You want to be a Europhile? Fine. But don't call yourself an Irish nationalist because you're not. You're against nationalism. You're a European nationalist, if you will. Being a European nationalist, it's a position for which I accord some respect. I don't hold it myself, but don't pretend that you're something that you're not. So then the EU Withdrawal Act was passed. That was that. And passed by huge majorities. Anna Soubry, who's now this hard woman of the Remainer faction, she voted for that. It's completely illogical, hypocritical, and moronic not to do so. Not to want to implement it. There we are. So then executive power. We mustn't get this mixed up with legislative power. So the executive is the Prime Minister, the Cabinet Ministers, those who can give orders, just say execute things, as in do it, as opposed to the legislature. And the Legislative Act is making laws, as in leges in Latin. So people don't get terribly confused about that. People say, oh, prorogation is dictatorship. I don't think so. Prorogations have been going on as long as Parliament's been going on. So the executive authority does not diminish legislative authority, or vice versa. So it's just never in the gift of Parliament to prorogue itself or to reassemble itself. It'll sit for 4 days fewer than otherwise would have done. What would they do in those 4 years they couldn't have done in the previous 3 years? So they were offered this deal by the European Union, 3 times rejected it. I think a fairly bad deal. Through gritted teeth, I would have voted for it. Leaving without an agreement could have been prevented, but Remainers, and it was mainly Remainers, refused to do so, so it's happening. Even Jacob Rees-Mogg, he was initially against Theresa May's agreement. He reluctantly came round to it. Through gritted teeth, he voted for it. He's now in the cabinet. And of course, he was one of those members of the Privy Council who went up to meet the Queen in Balmoral. The Privy Council, as it means private council. So it's most cabinet ministers. Cabinet ministers, they have this prefix, the Right Honourable. Okay? And when they leave the cabinet, they're still called that. The Prime Ministers, obviously the Right Honourable. Various other people are in the Privy Council, usually the leader of the opposition. Jeremy Corbyn is the Right Honourable. Sometimes leader of other parties, like I said, the leader of the Liberal Democrats might be Right Honourable. And there's a weekly meeting with the Queen. In fact, very few of them go. To be quorate, they need 3 of them, which is why 3 of them went to Balmoral. That's the Queen's private estate in Aberdeenshire. When Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861, Queen Victoria purchased this private estate. So the Prime Ministers are invited there every August for 1 week, but really she doesn't receive many official guests, and the royal family can relax away from the gaze of the media. That's that. Suppose the monarchy were abolished, they would still own Balmoral because they own it in their private capacity. So Jacob Rees-Mogg went up there to meet her to ask her to sign this, and of course she did sign it because then she can remain apolitical. So their meetings are very brief, and to ensure brevity, the Privy Councils have to stand for these meetings. Otherwise, so they won't rabbit on too long. Don't make them too comfortable. So anyway, that's that. The UK is leaving with or without an agreement. That was known when that was passed. It wasn't contingent, the Withdrawal Act, on an agreement being reached. You could have put that in the Act, but they didn't. Now, the thing is, this could be prevented. Remember, way back in March, the clock was ticking. Yvette Cooper, leading Labour MP, and some Conservatives, they passed a resolution to force Theresa May to request another extension, a long extension for the UK's membership of the European Union, and they got their way. But that act of that Withdrawal Act, it could be repealed by Parliament. Could be repealed by Parliament as soon as they sit. Have to get through all three readings of the House of Commons and House of Lords. Now that's a real hassle, a legislative timetable. But when Edward VIII resigned, his abdication, the Abdication Act, got through all three readings of the House of Commons and House of Lords in one day. So if nobody opposes it, there's virtually no debate. You can do these things super fast. But that really is a one-off exception. And of course, either side will filibuster, which is the pretty word for time waste, which is a parliamentary tactic. You can only do that to a certain extent. There is a guillotine. There are ways of cutting it off because Charles Stewart Parnell of the Home Rule Party in the 1880s, they used to time waste like nobody's business. So Parliament's got wise to that. In the House of Lords, people can say, I move a point of order. I move that the noble lord be no longer heard. Do you agree that no deal Brexit only refers to no withdrawal agreement? Well, yes, it does. What else would it possibly mean? So there was a withdrawal agreement offered by the European Union, and that's that. They said it shan't be renegotiated. Now, Angela Merkel's gone soft on that. Emmanuel Macron has not. And there were issues about the Irish border. Boris Johnson says he absolutely doesn't want one, no physical checks. I don't know anyone who does want one. Only that absolute moron Donald Trump says build a wall. Well, nobody in the Republic of Ireland, no unionist, nationalist, loyalist, Republican wants one. Even those who want the border to exist, want Northern Ireland to be in the UK, they're not talking about building a wall. What's the next thing? So to try and ensure there's smooth trade, because some goods were accepted in the UK or were accepted in the EU. Will they be accepted after this? We just don't know. And even things like landing rights, the single sky is partly to do with the EU. But do you really think that EasyJet won't be allowed to land in Luton on the 1st of November? Or indeed, British Airways won't be allowed to land in Paris Charles de Gaulle on that day? I think they will. There will be certain issues that have to sort out. There have been over a dozen countries already said to the United Kingdom, your current trade deal with us under the auspices of the EU, we'll just continue on that basis until we can work something out. A couple of years ago, Iceland with only 300,000 people, made a trade deal with China. Okay? So the UK outnumbers Iceland by, I think, 190 to 1. Think about that. 190 to 1. If Iceland can get a trade agreement with the People's Republic of China, the UK can certainly get some sort of trade deal. You might say it'll be less advantageous than it is now. I don't know. But the idea that trade is going to dry up is really for the birds. Stop these absurd scare tactics. I expect there will be a dislocation. There will be some confusion, some disruption. It's not going to be absolutely smooth. But I really don't think we're all going to get scurvy. We're told we're not going to have fruit and vegetables. We're going to run out of medicine. I think Project Fear has actually ground to a halt because it's embarrassing even the Remainer side. Yeah, the pound has gone down, fell in value by about 1 cent against the euro. I think we can live with that. We've experienced greater hardship. Are you really that much of a skinflint that you care that badly about a penny? So the Act of Withdrawal could be repealed, as I said. It could happen before the 1st of November. Just like the Act of Accession, when the United Kingdom, when the Treaty of Rome was signed, there was a European Communities Act. Although an Act of Accession was passed to the treaty, now these acts of parliaments could be repealed by subsequent parliaments. Remember Nigel Farage saying that years ago, and Lord Willoughby de Brooke, a UKIP peer. So treaties are signed, and they're signed on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen, were actually brought to her to sign, but she doesn't go. The Prime Minister goes to sign. This is a royal prerogative. A prerogative is both a duty and a right. So acting as a monarch, doing things by royal fiat, just let it be done. and she only acts on the advice of her ministers. So that's why the Prime Minister is borrowing these royal powers and then going back to her and asking her to approve. And then she always does. So the Queen reigns, but she doesn't rule. The idea of her rule is a sort of pleasing constitutional fiction. She is the merest figurehead, a living symbol, the glory of the nation reflected back to itself through the monarch. You might not find that palatable, but I do. Treaties are ratified before Parliament, but the Constitutional Reform Act of 2010 said that this didn't need to be the case for EU treaties. I wonder why not? Just because in case there might be too much parliamentary opposition. So greater control will come back to Parliament because powers will be repatriated from the EU. Now, of course, they were debated in the European Parliament, but it was a very complicated situation, whereas only the European Commission could propose legislation, if I got that right, and there was co-decision between the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers. It was very complicated. There was a lot of secret deliberation. So a lot of people said it wasn't a Parliament worth its salt. So that's that. That's why Boris Johnson is doing what he's doing, why he's able to do what he's doing. If there's an attempt to Parliament to stop Brexit, it'll be difficult for him to fight that off, given that even with support from the Democratic Unionist Party, he's got a majority of one. Remember, the 7 Sinn Féiners are not there, because Sinn Féin, they refuse to swear an oath of loyalty to Her Britannic Majesty, since they don't regard themselves as British, and at some level they don't accept that Northern Ireland is part of the UK. Well then, stop taking your salaries, stop taking all your allowances. And another one is you bring cases to the United Kingdom's courts. It is the most sickeningly hypocritical nonsense that they do this. They accept that there is justice, complain there's no justice. It's completely illogical, self-defeating. It's just nauseating. But if they were to hold their nose and take that oath, then they could possibly make the difference. 7 votes would count for a lot when the government's got a wafer-thin majority. And remember, there are a few Conservative MPs, Ken Clarke, Oliver Letwin, who are passionate Europhiles, who would vote to prevent Brexit, even with an agreement, I suspect, vote to prevent Brexit, who might even vote no confidence in the current government, bring down their own party, force a general election, bring in Corbyn even temporarily, maybe not Jeremy Corbyn, maybe he's just unacceptable to them, maybe Harriet Harman, maybe Ken Clarke himself, as an interim Prime Minister to try and prevent this. There is no such thing as an interim Prime Minister under the UK's constitution. It's very unclear what the UK's constitution is, but no one's ever had that title beforehand. So you're either Prime Minister or you're not, and that could last longer. We've had Prime Ministers of very, very brief periods. They're usually not countable. I say Lord Waldegrave in the 18th century, or the Earl of Bath in the 18th century. Waldegrave was there for 2 days, and his descendant was a Conservative politician in the 80s and 90s, now Provost of Eton. So the price of failure was high for William Waldegrave when he lost his seat in 97. And the Earl of Bath, well, that's that. It'll be very difficult for them to get this through if they require any more legislation, the Conservatives. Explain how the Irish backstop is undemocratic. Oh, well, did I say it was undemocratic? Well, I better tell you what the Irish backstop is. Okay, so the idea was UK leaves the European Union. Northern Ireland is the only part of the UK which has a land border with the EU, as in the Republic of Ireland. So because people are going back and forth all the time, like even bringing their sheep back and forth, there's some farms which straddle the border. That is the nature of borders. There's this absolutist fallacy that, oh, we can't have a border here because it's ridiculous to have it here when the field is halfway across the field. This is the kind of thing Irish nationalists said. That would apply to all land borders. You couldn't have a maritime border for that matter either, because the sea is exactly the same whether it's here or there. There's a border in between. But anyway, so that Northern Ireland would remain in regulatory alignment with the EU. All the EU legislation on health and safety or of standards at work and of products and services would remain there unless and until the UK and the EU agreed some other arrangement for Northern Ireland. Okay, that was the backstop. That was going to be the long-term solution unless they agreed some alternative. And some people were saying, no, that's bad because for 2 reasons. First of all, it treats Northern Ireland separately to the rest of the UK. And second of all, because the United Kingdom can't get out of it, ever. If the EU says no, 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 and shoots down any proposal, no matter how reasonable, you're stuck with it. Now, I mean, I think it was acceptable because, Northern Ireland is only 3% of the UK population. Remember, about 54% of people there voted to stay in the EU. Almost every nationalist voted for it. A few unionists voted for it. Those who voted against were almost all unionists. A handful of hardline nationalists voted against it because they say, well, we want Irish independence. Being part of the EU is not independence. Being part of the UK is not independence. There's some logic and consistency there, which you don't find from the SDLP or Sinn Féin. So is it anti-democratic? I don't think so. And Theresa May, she tied herself into knots. Well, she pointed herself into a corner making contradictory promises. This is how she sold the camel twice. First of all, assuring the DUP, to get confidence in supply agreement, that Northern Ireland would not be treated differently from the bulk of the United Kingdom, and secondly, agreeing the backstop. There's a contradiction there. Now, the DUP were also caught in a rock and a hard place. They want Northern Ireland to be treated the same as the rest of the United Kingdom. At the same time, they don't want any border checks. And the European Union saying, well, if you in the UK, including Northern Ireland, have got some goods and services which don't meet our standards, we think they're not safe enough or whatever, or not produced fairly, like your workers are not paid sufficiently, either work too long hours or they work in dangerous conditions, then we want to see that and check that and just not allow these commodities in, for example. So we'd have to say, stop, open your van, what do you got in there? Not searching for drugs or weapons, though it could be that, could happen any time, but searching for goods which are not permissible in the EU. Now, I'm told that actually apparently border checks happen anyway between the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. They're just very rare. Back in the 60s, it happened quite a lot, and that was a trade issue. Because remember, before the Troubles, the UK and Irish Republic had a free trade agreement. And then in 1973, obviously both in the EEC, and there wasn't complete regulatory alignment immediately. That came in over time. But the border checks then were to do with the conflict, illegal weapons and bombs, and wanted men going back and forth. That was about that. So nobody's suggesting building a border wall. There was no border fence. There are a few watchtowers, all dismantled about 10 years ago. So I don't think it is anti-democratic, and it's not a perfect solution. And the problem with that is then in North Britain, Nicola Sturgeon will say, well, what about Caledonia? Most of us voted to stay in the EU. Why can't we have this if Northern Ireland's got it? Well, there's a difference because you don't border another EU member state. Northern Ireland, for a century, has always been treated as a special case, a little bit differently. Their police were armed for a long time, high growl, and, they had some special legislation there. They had devolution when nowhere else in the UK had it, and on and on. Okay, that's all for tonight. That's a very, very long video. It's a record for me, my longest ever. So please tell your friends about this. Get them to subscribe. I rely on donations to keep this channel going. So you can donate to me at PayPal. You'll find me through the following email address, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. I'll repeat that. It's all small letters, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Please donate to me on PayPal. You can find me on Twitter and indeed on Facebook, posting these things, and indeed Instagram. So I'll spell my name if you want to find me to donate to me on PayPal, GeorgeCallahan79@gmail.com. See you later.